Dr. Najeeba Syeed is a peacemaker, healer, scholar, and overall badass. She's an associate professor of Muslim and Interreligious Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary, and she's the director of the Center for Global Peacebuilding. She's recognized as a leader in peacebuilding and social justice, and she's received many awards for her work. She's been the subject of many news reports and documentaries, and as we were discussing before this conversation, she's been the subject of other research, given all the innovative stuff that she's doing. As a scholar, she co-designed a doctoral program in interreligious education. She's directing dissertations on topics including resilience in interreligious learning, decolonial models for interreligious programs, Christian Buddhist peacemaking in Southeast Asia, Black Muslim community practical theologies of community development. There's so much that she's doing that's super interesting. I'm excited to have her with us today. I also want to mention she's currently co-editing a book with Heidi Hadso on critical approaches to interreligious education. And the title of her own forthcoming book is Politics of Interreligious Education. Dr. Syeed is a well-known figure among faith-based activists, especially those involved in peace building and immigration rights. And she's well-known among scholars of religion too, especially those who are interested in how the study and practice of religion can prepare and move people to fight for justice. So I'm really glad to have her. I wanted to bring her into our conversation to help us understand what interreligious engagement looks like, how we move it into anti-racism and justice work, and what all of that has to do with immigration and xenophobia and the things that she works on. Thank you for watching the Religion News Service series, Anti-Racism as a Spiritual Practice. I'm your host, Dr. Simranjeet Singh, and this episode is part of the second season of our series, which we filmed late in 2020. The first season, which was entitled Becoming Less Racist, can be viewed on religionnews.com. We thank Columbia University and Trinity University for their support in making the second season possible. Thanks for joining our program today, Anti-Racism as a Spiritual Practice. It's a gift to be with you all, and I'm hopeful that our session proves fruitful to you and offers some guidance in a world that feels overwhelming and exhausting and difficult to navigate. Our vision is to offer two things that we believe the world needs badly right now. First, we want to offer you insight into what racism looks like and feels like in its various forms. And that's why we spend so much of our time together listening to our guests, learning from their experiences and listening to their stories. Our goal here is to step into the shoes of those who, by virtue of their unique identities, have experiences and perspectives that are different from ours. And this approach draws from James Baldwin's wisdom, who said, "If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." The other thing we hope to do here is to receive guidance from our guests on how to move from just understanding racism into taking action. And action could mean many different things. Typically, when we think about anti-racism, we think about it as correcting problems out there in the world. But what we're really trying to do in these sessions is to dig within ourselves, to look at the problems that we hold within, and to try and address those. And that's what we mean by anti-racism as a spiritual practice. So thank you all for being here, for joining us, for being on this journey together. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting in my apartment in Manhattan, New York, which is traditionally the land of the Lenape, the indigenous nation that made their homes here, raised their kids here, buried their dead here. They were removed from these lands by European colonizers so the city could be built. And we're grateful to the Lenape people for stewarding this land over the centuries. So Dr. Syeed, thank you for being with us. I'll spare you the question of asking you how you're doing, since that seems unfair to ask people these days. So I'll start by asking you informally, how's everything on your end in terms of the teaching? I know you're new to the Chicago Theological Seminary. How's it going for you there?
Well, I'm really excited to start at a new seminary, and you know, it's funny, I remember in my first job interview for my last position, I was in the midst of the job interview, and one of the colleagues said, you know, what would it be like for you to be the only Muslim in a group of Christian faculty members? And they added, who are mostly white. And I said, well, that's pretty much what's happening in this interview process. So it was interesting to me that they recognized race and religion. And then I named what we were doing in that moment. It was a diverse faculty. It was just who was in that room at that moment. So I think for me, that notion of being the one and only on a consistent basis, I feel like it's been incredible. I have the capacity to be a part of the spiritual formation of Christian students, of Muslim students, and then we have a wide other sort of diversity of students that are attracted to the graduate study of religion in seminaries. It's not just religious people. And so I feel like it's an honor and a gift, and it keeps me on my toes. And I also try on a consistent basis to keep the institutions that I work for on their toes around issues of diversity, inclusion, and extending that into the academic study of religion as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you say that, because typically when we hear from folks saying they're the only ones in the room, and having to carry the load, they describe it as exhausting and burdensome, and you seem energized by it. Do you feel exhausted by it? Is it a little bit of both, or how does it work?
The literature on what we would sort of identify as tokenism, as being the one and only, the literature consistently validates that it is exhausting, that it is emotionally and physically trying. So I definitely think that that's the case, and it just depends on the different moments in time. I have in my embodiment at any one time, as we talk about the intersection of spirituality and anti-racism and religion, at any one time being a South Asian immigrant who received my citizenship at the age of 15, immigrating from Kashmir, coming to America, growing up mostly in the Midwest and moving to the East Coast and now to the West Coast, being a woman. There's so many factors of who I am that at any one moment, with what's happening in the headlines in the news, beyond whether I'm an activist or even deeply concerned about the topic, I am often the topic of conversation. I am often what I'm studying. I am often what I am teaching. And that takes its toll too, not just being the one and only, but in particular, I talk about it in my work that for students, particularly a Christian background, and me being a South Asian brown professor, that I'm sometimes the first text. My body is the first text, even before they experience the Quran, before they read the religious tradition that I'm teaching. My body is the text, as someone who's also visibly Muslim. So it's a fascinating experience to be both an instructor, but then be an embodied text. And our students experience that in different ways, even before I open my mouth. So that takes its toll, being constantly interpreted.
Yeah. Oh man, I can't imagine. I mean, in some senses I can imagine, but as you're talking about your own identities, right? Like I have mine, and I have my experiences with mine, and we all have ours. But you sort of like ran down the list, and I'm like, oh man, you check all the boxes. And then it's like you check the boxes in what sense, right? Like of what you want to be in society, what you don't want to be. I mean, neither. It's like who you are. It's just who you are, and then other people put onto you whatever their feelings are about those identities. But yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about your childhood and your formation growing up? I mean, you mentioned where are you really from, Najeeba?
I'm happy to talk about it. I came to the United States with my family when I was 3 years old as part of the migration in the 60s and 70s, the brain drain of South Asia. My parents came here to study. And for a long time, I wasn't sure if I was going to be staying in America. So I didn't come aware. I remember telling people when I was 7 or 8, I've been in America for this number of years. And then after a period of time when my father got his green card, then it became clear to me that we were going to be staying in the United States. But I had a consciousness of being an immigrant, of not knowing if this would be my home. and then growing up through periods of time during the Iran hostage crisis, Muslims being, people think that for immigrant Muslims, I'm speaking here in particular, that there was sort of a claim of identity after 9/11. I actually remembered in 1979 what it was like to hear like songs on the radio that were bomb Iran, and being associated with being Iranian American, although obviously I ethnically and otherwise I had no connection to Iran, but being elided into that identity and this notion of Islam as a threat. So there are people who have been writing about the immigrant Muslim experience that recognize, for instance, that it wasn't just 9/11, that Islamophobia wasn't born on that, in that moment, that there have been throughout history moments in which immigrant Muslims have been in some ways dehumanized. So I just wanted to point that out, that xenophobia and Islamophobia and their intersection, this is not a new phenomenon. So particularly scholars who talk about the Iranian American or Iranian Canadian experience, I would encourage people to read about it, because it gives you a sense of that reality. Since unfortunately Iran and the US, the ways that Iran has been portrayed and Iranians have been portrayed, and continuing into the era of the Muslim ban, these things didn't come out suddenly. They had a very long history predating what many people who are alive now would remember.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Can you tell us a little bit about being Kashmiri? I mean, that's
Yeah, I think that's really complicated too, because I live now in a time where my country of birth, India, there's kind of a transnational Islamophobia. And that's something, the other intersection between xenophobia and Islamophobia is that a lot of the transnational Islamophobia is manifesting, as we see in Europe, but also in other countries, for instance, in Myanmar, and how the Rohingya Muslims are treated, or in China, this idea of Muslims as foreigners, I think, is really utilized. If you look at the trope of Muslims in parts of Europe, this idea of Muslims as foreigner, and this incapacity of Muslims to govern themselves peacefully as citizens, and whether you extend citizenship. So that has been contested as part of US American history, but also if you look at, as I mentioned, in Myanmar right now, in parts of India, the immigration laws, or the ways that migration or migrants are treated, or designating people who have a historical presence as migrants, so you can utilize whatever xenophobic policy. So I think often Islamophobia and xenophobia, the reason I wanted to really frame it that way is to see how these patterns emerge, and that in fact things like the Muslim ban in the United States becomes replicated by governments in India, or other forms of anti-immigrant as well as anti-Muslim bias manifest in migration policies in ways that are replicated around the world. So Islamophobic policies that happen in one nation, unfortunately, do find themselves multiplied and justified, so that if you can attach the word Islam or Muslim to a minority, particularly migrant population, it unfortunately has been justified in multiple places. And some of these populations are huge. We're not talking about small numbers, but that has really concerned me, and that's why I have really been looking at the intersection of migration and Islamophobia.
Can you take us back to your immigration experience? Right, you come to this country at 15. You're old enough.
I came when I was 3, and
Oh,
I got my green card when I was in 5th grade. I remember all of these things because I wasn't able to leave the US until I got my green card. And I got my green card when I was in Los Angeles and I was in 4th grade. And that's the first time I was able to cross the border. We went to Mexico. My family went to Mexico on the resident alien card. And then I became a citizen when I think I was a freshman in high school. And that's the first time I could go back to Kashmir because of the way that many of people in my family had been treated, and the way that many Muslims were targeted at that time. It was difficult to travel. So we were able to have the protection of US citizenship to be able to go back and travel. So migration and my religious identity have played back and forth between my country of birth and then my country of adoption, both in ways that have been positive and protective, and other times they have been targeted and difficult to handle. So yeah, so I remember each step of the migration, the naturalization process, because it allowed me to do certain things and then gave me new forms of identity, but also new forms of struggle.
And did you feel like, this first trip back to Kashmir, did you feel like it was a trip home? Did you feel like you were finding a place where you really belong?
Yeah, I mean, it was really an important piece of my exploration of a particularly at that time, and still, the line of control between India and Pakistan has one of the highest number of military to civilian ratios in the world. So to go to Kashmir and see the military presence, it did something to me psychologically at that age, and had an imprint on understanding that violence is affects everyday people, and that the political rhetoric and the language that comes out in the national or international media, seeing folks impacted on the ground. But it also allowed, I think, for me, something that John Paul Lederach, who's a peacemaker and scholar, talks about, is doing work in your own backyard. He's an international peacemaker, a Christian peacemaker. And when I came back to the US at the age of 15, I thought, I need to be able to, America is now my nation, and I need to do and be engaged with issues of violence prevention in the United States. So for me, and I ended up choosing a Quaker college in North Carolina because Quakers, as you know, have from their inception been anti-war, anti-violence. And that was a really important piece of me learning how to see religion, which is so often demonized, but also instrumentalized for violence, to see it used in really not just for peacemaking, but also in an really more than just nonviolence, but anti-violence, anti-militarization. And so it was a really wonderful experience for me. I was the only Muslim when I went there. I went to college. It's funny, I was thinking about this. I'm always heralded by an article. A Muslim comes to this college, and they wrote about it when I was newsworthy at the age of 17, and then I became the first Muslim professor at another institution. And it's interesting to always, it's just funny that it's funny to be to have that experience. Now that we're talking about it, while I was in college, there were no other Muslims. So Diana Eck, my dad ended up telling Diana Eck a story about my college experience when I went for Ramadan. And I grew up in a very deeply close-knit Muslim community in Northern Virginia. And I had never fasted on my own. And if you know, Ramadan or fasting is a very communal experience. And so I remember my friends, as well as the Quaker chaplain at my school, making sure that I had people to break fast with, that I had people to wake up and have the pre-dawn meal with. And so that story has made it into one of Diana Eck's books on religion and pluralism in the United States. But it's funny to, since I've been very young, religious pluralism, and as we're talking, being in the presence of other religious traditions and engaging, but trying to continue to maintain practice and solidarity has really brought me through a lot of those experiences. So.
I appreciate that, and I'm getting the sense of, this is a side of you or a story about you that I didn't actually know. How did you get into peacemaking? It seems like it's part of your experiences growing up and part of who you are and where your family comes from, and that really resonates with me in terms of the way that I got into racial justice work, which I was I was dealing with it personally and with my family, and it became a life calling almost. And so let me ask you a couple of questions regarding your work and how you do it. I guess the first place I want to go is around the way that you engage and you do this work is cross identities, right? Like you're very intentional about being intersectional, and that shows up in your scholarship, that shows up in your activism. And I'm wondering, how do you get to a place where you see the value in doing this work across communities? And I say that because so often religion, I mean, all identities, but religion especially, and especially the cultural context that you're coming from, where identity is so contested, and there's real violence, and there's real harm that comes around who you are and where you come from. And you seem like you've been able to go beyond that you're not so restrained or constrained by these boundaries of identity and work across them. And so where does that come from for you, and why does that seem so important?
I mean, I don't think that I'm less restrained or that I am striving for a society that's colorblind in any way. I think for me, at the very heart of it is the fact that anti-racism to me is a spiritual practice. So the justification for it for me is the Quranic verse that all human beings are created with honor, with dignity, karama. So every human being has a God-given dignity. And to me, what that means is when that dignity is violated through policies, I have, if we think about Heschel's notion of marching as praying, for me, protest in its various forms comes from also Prophet Muhammad's saying that the best exertion, one of the best exertions, and it's translated, unfortunately, the word jihad is so often translated as holy war, where for Muslims, we have many boys named jihad because it actually means spiritual exertion. That the best exertion, when he was asked, was to speak a word of truth contesting a tyrannical leader. So it's actually a non-violent form of protest. And so for me, this notion of protest isn't just a transactional pursuit to have a distributive justice for the rights that have been violated, but it's a dignity violation. And as we now know through the research in human rights, that it's actually dignity violations that are the most lasting. You don't have to necessarily be physically violated, but your dignity, you're humiliated, you're dehumanized. So it kind of, one way to answer it is to think about some of this. I'll give you just a couple of stories that help me think about the work that I do. One of them was, so one of the ways that this government particularly has sought to dehumanize communities as a whole is to do policies in a very chaotic way. So we had the first Muslim ban happen, and we were storming airports, waiting, didn't know who could come off, who could come on. Children were separated from their parents. And it was really powerful because in Los Angeles, some of the folks that showed up were from Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And it was clarity for me that the intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw and others have talked about and has now been abused so much intellectually and misunderstood, that part of the value of having Black Lives Matter there was to say that this is a form of state violence that has to be contested. That what the civil rights movement was marching against was state violence. When on the day that Jeff Sessions came to Los Angeles, I joined clergy mostly from the immigration rights community, and mostly because of the presence in Los Angeles, organizations that really work closely with the Latinx community and some with the African immigrant community. And that day we were standing for family separation. And then we heard that the Supreme Court had upheld the Muslim ban. And my colleagues from the immigrants' rights community said, Najeeba, you need to speak on this. So I ended up giving a impassioned speech and tying it to family separation. And so stories like that were in the moment of protest. It isn't my cause or my community or your cause and your community. It's a recognition that particularly because I do this work mostly with clergy, that there has been a violation of human dignity. And we as spiritual people have to understand that that violation needs to be addressed, witnessed, benchmarked, spoken of, and be put in the public square as a sin. So to me, that is where that type of work comes from. And it's not a calculated, strategic approach to organizing. It is a spiritual, sacred resistance in and of itself.
I appreciate that. I mean, there's so much in what you just said, and it's, I mean, the stories themselves and so much we can unpack. And I mean, I guess where my mind is going right now is to this point of anti-racism as a spiritual practice for you as you draw it from your tradition, and it being about upholding your own dignity. That doing this work is about serving those who are suffering, but it's also about serving yourself in some way. And I'd love to hear more about that. What is it to you that calls you to do this work in a way? I mean, I guess maybe the way to ask this question is, what do you get out of doing this work? Because I see what you do. You're constantly on the streets. You're putting your body in harm's way. You get the death threats and all this sort of stuff. We've talked about that before. And so you must be getting something significant out of doing this work. And can you speak to that a little bit? What are you getting out of it?
Definitely. I mean, one thing I'm really clear about is that this language of charity, of pity, is really problematic. So in the Muslim tradition, Prophet Muhammad says that there's no veil between the prayer of the oppressed and God, so that those that are experiencing oppression are actually in a very sacred space, that to walk, and sometimes that person is me. It's not always me. And there are people who suffer far more, but this is not an endeavor of pity. This is a recognition. Linda Tuhuwai Smith, a scholar of Indigenous studies, talks about the fact that that people who have survived oppression, and particularly she's speaking about Indigenous communities, the fact that they still exist in and of itself is a witness to those that are continuing that oppression. So what I mean by that is, I don't think that very often I'm targeted because I'm weak. I feel like I'm targeted because I'm strong. I'm targeted because I come to the table with power, because I come to the table saying, you know what? I have a power that means that I have not just survived, but I continue to flourish despite the attempts against my community. Despite all of that, I have a space and a capacity, and my resilience is in fact resistance in and of itself. So I don't see the targeting of me because I'm weak. I see the targeting because I'm a witness. My very physical and emotional, spiritual, psychological text that I create in my body is a recognition of oppressive systems. And so anyone from other, in other positionality. So the reason I share that is because that to me is what spiritual practice brings to this conversation, is that I have spiritual resources that have been passed on, whether it's ancestral gifts, that present me in such a way that I'm incredibly powerful in ways that rearrange how power is defined. So I think that in fact I am a challenge to the way that power exists right now, and I work with that in such a way that I think it's a spiritual gift, and that I have an obligation to be at the table. And if the table isn't going to work for me, I'll create my own table, So I just think I that's why sometimes the language of marginality or centering, I am centered in my own narrative. And I feel like part of the reason we are targeted, depending on who we are, is because of that power and that witness to that oppression.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you say, because I'm imagining in everyday American, whatever that means, everyday American, listening to you say that and be like, wait, but that's the opposite of what I hear about Muslim women, right? Like a Muslim woman is someone who covers because they're oppressed, because of misogyny, they have no agency, right? Like it's anti-feminist, all these things that sort of one might expect when they see you on the street, and assumptions they would have about not just who you are, but also what you're about. And to hear you say that, it's so powerful because you're flipping the script, right? You're saying this is not that. And so I wonder, what does that feel like to you when you're constantly hearing these narratives or seeing these on TV, right? Like in your own mind, you're the center of your story, right? And you're writing that story. But that's not true in the general public. And so how does that dissonance feel to you, and how do you deal with that?
I mean, I think in my work, I talk particularly about Muslim women, and one of the incredible functions of Muslim women is that we have, some of us, within our own capacity of interacting, an embodied pluralism. So what to others looks like so complicated to hold, or there's so many burdens, we in fact reconcile those in our embodiment without needing an excuse, permission, or it's not an intellectual exercise to be able to put all of these different parts together, whether we choose to identify as religious or not deeply religious. But the fact that we have some aspect of Muslimness in our embodiment. And I think that that has been a really important piece of how we expose through our embodiment, not just the targeting of or the use of religion for hatred or racism, but also how supposedly secular spaces are very deeply racist or deeply misogynistic. So as Muslim women navigate both religious and secular spaces, and we see, for instance, Muslim women's bodies and places like Belgium and France and other parts of the world where there is such an obsession with how Muslim women choose to dress and regulating that, and also in parts of Canada. So I think it's really interesting to me that Muslim women, in many ways, the way that we experience Islamophobia is gendered, as Jasmine Zine would say. And I wanted to point out a couple of just sort of 3 lessons that I have learned that have been really important in the intersection of Islamophobia and xenophobia. One of them is rethinking boundaries, and particularly rethinking borders. So very often migration work focuses on the borders of the United States, which are really important spaces. And I crossed the border to Tijuana. I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is there is an incredible diversity of migrants coming through the southern border. And for instance, there is a large Haitian community that has been waiting for years at the border, and the southern border is now a state of liminality between 2 nations. And there is such a religious diversity as well for those that are coming. But you can see physical borders. What we've learned with the Muslim ban is there are these invisible borders. How do you count the people that couldn't come? How do you count the places where the United States has had a role in Yemen in supporting wars and then cutting off people from coming there? So it's this kind of imprisonment of people by closing off the physical border, but also creating, particularly in Muslim spaces, and this tie of xenophobia with racism. And so these idea of borders, I've really been thinking a lot more than just about the notion of borders, and migrant activists are beginning to think about how do we reframe the conversation around borders, because we're creating borders by bans, by the African ban, by the Muslim ban, that are racist, xenophobic, but you don't get to see those stories. You can't show a mother, you can't show a child at this border because the border doesn't exist. It's an invisible policy that has closed a book of a country and doesn't allow any new authors into it. So I can go on about that. I also think one of the most important things that I have thought about recently in my work is the visibilization of race and eugenics in migration and Islamophobia. And I think we're only beginning to talk about Islamophobia and eugenics in the United States, but we know that some of the founders of the anti-migration organizations in the United States, as we're looking into the research of their papers, their perspectives, there is a deeply, deeply racist and at times was anti-Semitic perspective on policymaking. I think it's a conversation that needs a lot more elucidation. But there are ways in which, for instance, Black Muslims have been invisibilized in the conversation of xenophobia and Islamophobia. We know that there are about 500,000 undocumented African Americans, Black immigrants in the United States, that Black immigrants and migrants are treated worse in places of incarceration than other incarcerated immigrants. So, how do we have a conversation around race, religion, xenophobia, and then, African American and Black migrants who come to the United States who are Muslim face, multiple layers of policy and surveillance that exists already in anti-Black racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia. So I just wanted to point out some of the stories that I think that need to be told in that intersection. One of the reasons I chose those 3 or 4 terms together. So I could go on, but I'm happy to entertain more questions.
I appreciate that, and I think you gesture towards something that's often overlooked, and that is the relationship between anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. And I think historically in this country, you cannot talk about Islamophobia without talking about anti-Black racism, because a large proportion of Black folks in this country were Muslim. A large proportion of Muslims in this country were Black. And so there's a really important conversation to be had there, which we don't think of, because the ways in which we've racialized Islam in the American mindset is that it's a Middle Eastern or Arab or brown community, and it's hard. We don't wrap our heads around the fact that Islam is a very ethnically and nationally diverse tradition. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
But both in the United States, for the earliest Muslims were Black Africans in the United States. So migration, but also now I think another part of the conversation is the migration of the increase in migrants that identify, whether it's from African nations or from parts of Europe and other that have a history that ties them to Africa. So I think that's a conversation that is also starting to happen, and many organizations are doing really good work. I mean, I would just point to many of the organizations in Minnesota that are doing work around Somali refugees, Somali identity. In many ways, they're at the forefront of community organizing for the Muslim community in the United States, and working in that intersection of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and other forms of bias.
That's great. I want to ask you one more question before we turn it over to the group, and that is, as someone who has experience in peacemaking, what advice do you have to people who are interested in getting involved? What would you suggest they do externally in terms of how they could get involved, but also what would you suggest that they do internally in order to really engage with this work?
I think I've evolved in this work in the last 25 years, and there are a couple of things. If you're engaging in it as a religious person, is to be able to do the questioning of when religion has healed you and has healed others that you work with, and when religion has played a role in hurting. And I think that's a very complex internal conversation to have. Since we're talking about spirituality and religion, I think that's an important piece that I had to come to, is to understand that it's not just the utilization of religion for violence at a larger social level, but it's the individual level. How did we experience our religious community, and not to assume that for everyone it was a positive experience. So that's part of the piece in that self work, is what are the spiritual resources that we have, whether we choose to identify religiously or not, what are the resources you have to deal with the trauma that some of us have experienced at the hand of religious actors in our life. And I think that's also a part of this conversation, that in the interreligious space, how do you make room for when religion has been the agent for racism, religion has been an agent for violent forms of sexism, whatever it may be. I think that religion heals and hurts, because you can very often, I've been brought into scenarios where people want to talk about religion and conflict resolution, and they only identify religion as irrational and problematic and the source of violence. So we have to be able to hold both of these, that religion is an agent for healing and for peace, and it has also been an agent for violence. And any religious community has that capacity. I remember I was asked once at a panel about religion and violence, and all the examples of violence were only Muslim-based communities. And I actually, when they asked me that question, I said, I tell people I won't come to the table if the conversation is just about, I consider myself a Muslim peacemaker because of my religion, not despite my religion. Like, my religion informs my peacemaking. So any community and any person has that capacity and that experience. The other thing that I think is really important, particularly looking at it from the interfaith piece, is that I have really redefined the goal of interfaith engagement in my own work to move away from words like civility, commonality alone, because what happens is we don't want to become agents of utilizing peacemaking and dialogue to actually do more violence. And I know I've traveled around the world where I've talked to communities where they've said, no, please, no more interfaith dialogue, because all it's done is used to bring together communities, and there's no change or there's no accountability or agency. So really being very clear about what is your goal for peacemaking, particularly if it's interreligious. And Teresa Gay Johnson, for instance, talks about this notion of civility for particularly communities of color in the United States, that civility is invoked as a goal once there has been dissent, particularly for Black communities in the United States, the history that suddenly everyone should be civil. So how do you address interpersonal peacemaking? How do you then also address what we call structural violence and structural racism as a peace builder? And so those are some of the analytical questions I ask myself. And I'll give you 3 questions that I use in every conflict situation. The first is, what is sacred to the parties? Who is human? Who is human? Who is being defined as human? And very often we'll find that not everyone is considered human, or the lens that people use. The third is, am I in your future? Is there a vision that includes me? And this is what I ask all the parties. I used to have very complex intakes, and these are now the 3 questions that relate to justice, that relate to dignity, and that relate to religion.
That's great. I love that. And that's so practical, and something that I'm going to start using, not just in peacemaking conversations, but I mean, every conversation, it seems like.
How old are your girls now?
Mine are 2 and 4, but yeah, that's going to be really useful. I mean, I'm thinking just about relationships, right? Like, that sounds like just a very powerful and beautiful way to go about relationships. So yeah, I love that. So, okay. So thank you so much for your time, and for all your expertise, and for sharing with us, and for everything that you do. We're all really grateful. So really appreciate you.
So what I was pointing out is that when I think part of the targeting is the fact that I haven't chosen to give up my identity. I haven't chosen to assimilate in a way that makes other people comfortable. For those that don't want to see immigrants here, or don't want to see practicing Muslims as part of the public square. So to me, the emotional part of it is understanding that my self-worth is something granted by God, and that when the language that's utilized against my community or against me personally, it certainly hurts. I mean, to hear some of the things that are said in the media, to consistently walk into rooms and parts of the country where suspicion is the first way that I'm greeted, if I'm greeted at all. There are many, many times that the response is it's difficult and it's complicated. What I was pointing out is that for me, one of the ways that I deal with it and recognize my power is that I I am here. Part of my role is to be a witness to the fact that that there is some form of dignity that's being violated. So that is an important task of mine, and I see that as sacred. I see that as something that is a part of my Muslim duty to stand up against injustice and not to sit quietly in silence. Because I think religious communities, all kinds of communities, one way to handle that targeting is to try to be quiet, try to push yourself, try to mix in, hide. Because of embodiment or practice, you can't always mix in, but to pull away. And my response has been sometimes strategically to stay alive in certain situations, that's necessary. And in other situations, I find that my presence and speaking up, whether it's affecting me or affecting someone else, I think standing up in solidarity with others who are experiencing some form of targeting is also really important. And that to me comes from a position of strength, and not strength to dominate the other, but strength in moral courage. So that's what I wanted to point out. It's a question of not I can win over you. I may never transactionally win. I may never get that, I may never get whatever back you took from me in the material sense, but in the moral sense, it's my obligation to stand up, because that is a question of moral courage. So that's where I was speaking in terms of strength. It's not, and that was what I was hoping we would redefine strength in this time as not the capacity to overcome someone else, but the capacity to be able to stand up for those types of violations. And so that was sort of what I was pointing to.
This idea of moral strength. How do you do that? How do you maintain moral courage without ending up feeling morally superior or holier than thou or something like that? Like how do you maintain that without becoming supremacist in that perspective?
Well, I think there are many ways to answer that question. I'll answer it from a more spiritual perspective. I can also answer it from a more academic perspective. To me, I think that moral courage isn't a question of me being better than someone else. It's a accountability question and holding people. So for instance, right now, there are all these conversations on civic engagement, and I've tried to reframe it as civic accountability. I'm not engaging or voting because I just want to engage with a civil structure. I want to actually hold that structure accountable to the values that it's supposed to articulate and hold on to. So I actually ask colleagues in interfaith settings, I talk about one of the important roles we have with one another is to interrupt one another. It's not actually just to build bridges, but once it's fascinating because for really good friends of mine, they'll say, Najeeba, we know the Muslim teaching on that. Are you holding yourself to that level of accountability? So it's fascinating that, my Muslim colleagues will do that, but also in the interreligious setting, they'll, I think this accountability factor is really important. So that's one of the questions I would ask us to think about is who are your accountability partners? To whom are you accountable? Who holds you to that moral standard? And how is that moral standard defined? Jenny Peace talks about it as co-formation when you're doing it as interreligious partners, The second thing is, I think humility is incredibly important in these conversations. The Quran tells us that even the way we walk on earth, we should walk lightly on the earth, because if you stomp on the earth, in some ways that is, in the Quran, the earth is animated with a voice actually in some ways, but it's even to show humility to the earth, that when you walk, you should walk softly, let your pace be soft. And that seems like a small thing, but I think about this idea of humility and bringing it to the work, not humbleness where you are pushed aside and silent. But one of the things that I think is so important as an organizer and an activist and as a scholar is to be a good listener. I don't think great change happens through one speech or sermon that changed the world. It's our capacity to listen. And if you reach the point when I talk about transformational leadership, if as a leader, when I tell my students, you are surrounded by a bunch of people who agree with you, that is the most toxic state of leadership. So I think part of this question of how do we deal with moral courage is to have the courage to admit when you're wrong, or to stand aside when you're not the right person to be most effective. So I think that is a constant, as a spiritual practice, it's a constant recognition that we as individuals bring to this conversation and this practice of anti-racism, and understanding particularly that not to reinvigorate a savior complex. And depending on what your embodiment is, I think that is more of an issue of taking up space. So I just wanted to kind of share that, this constant, who are your accountability partners? And are you, or are we engaging in listening and showing up in ways that we're invited to, not in ways that we determine ourselves as individuals based in our ego are the most helpful or bring us the most recognition?
That's really helpful. Thank you.
There's a whole field of peace studies, and now we have an iteration, as every discipline seems to, called critical peace studies. It's like you had the first
Oh
bet.
yes, there's critical librarianship. That's what I have to do.
Which I think is great. I think that's really important. For me, in my work, I look at how structures of violence create cultures of violence. So that scholarship comes from John Galtung and Elise Boulding, a Quaker scholar. So she talked about this notion of cultures of violence and cultures of peace, and that the way peace is created or produced should have iterations across the whole social gamut, the governmental structures. So for instance, if you take the issue of people who live without shelter, homelessness in Los Angeles, where I live, that is a form of structural violence. The fact that hundreds of people die in the streets, and for instance, a Catholic church has every year a vigil for those that have died that are nameless. Nameless not because they didn't have a name, but because the society didn't recognize nor deem it important enough to have a ritual. So I think that's a form of structural violence, where I have more and more in my work talked about the myth of interpersonal peacemaking, and particularly in the interreligious space, that if you can get, let's say, two people from two different religious communities on the side of a conflict to get along, then they'll be okay. And we've spent millions, if not billions of dollars on that, millions probably, because peace is the most underfunded strategy. War is the most overfunded strategy. So let's keep it clear. We still have very little resources behind these peace building programs. But how do we think about community organizing? How do we think about anti-racism work as embedded in peace building? I think the problem has been they've been separated out, and peace is really the most theologically, religiously abstract concept. So I start every graduate course where I teach peace building. I tell my students, draw what peace looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, because it has to be something that is a vision rooted in justice. In the work that I do, rooted in justice and equity. If you are doing peacemaking or studying peace without a power analysis, it's not even ultimately the most effective way to do peacemaking, right? Conflict exists, particularly when there are forms of disparity. And until they are addressed, any solution will not be durable. We talk about it as durability. And for instance, the United Nations, in adopting Section 1325, the idea of women being part of this is also gendered. I think I wanted to mention that too. But the idea of women being at the table and part of the dispute resolution process is also, women do most of the peacemaking across religious lines. Women cross all over in the United States when it's women who've lost their children to police violence, to gang violence, that are doing the peacemaking in the streets. Women will be doing the interreligious, or Atin Anwar talks about it in the Indonesian context. They'll do the peacemaking work in the informal sense, but when the formal structures come into negotiation, they are often excluded. So I think that's how part of this conversation is also gendered in that way. But the reason I really wanted to structure this conversation of Islamophobia and xenophobia is to return to the role that the state has in enforcing migration, borders, citizenship, criminalizing the crossing of borders, the seeking of asylum. And we live in a time where that has been defined and refined as a science of discrimination, the intersection between Islamophobia and xenophobia, whether it's done at the legislative level, whether it's done by decreasing the number of refugees while creating conflicts that increase the number of refugees, but decreasing the admission of refugees. So there are so many factors that I just wanted to outline. That was why I chose that framing, that one, if you're doing work or interested in doing work on Islamophobia, it must take into account the role of the state around xenophobia as well. And I think we are reaching the point where these different movements are more in conversation with each other as well. That's something I wanted to point out in practical pieces, is look at how these movements can be more in conversation. That's something we created in Los Angeles, so that when the sheriff's department is collaborating with ICE, how does that bring Black Lives Matter LA to the table and bring migration activists to the table? So how do we, instead of competing, recognize not just who is targeted, but the strategies that are used for xenophobia, the technologies that are used in surveillance of Islamophobia and xenophobia are intersecting, the ways that mass incarceration and private prisons have been galvanized in migration are often, those strategies go back and forth. The way that police are becoming militarized at the borders, that is a part of what happens in the way that Americans in cities are treated. So I just want to point out that that was part of the goal today, is practical steps of engaging in fighting Islamophobia and xenophobia as a spiritual practice has to take into account all of these factors created by the state. And that has always been the case, that the spiritual message of Dr. King and others, and that interreligious component of the civil rights movement, which is ongoing, never ended. Some people think it's over, was always and has been a recognition that the state can be a source of violence, and part of what religious leaders can do is to hold the state accountable in what I would call civic and civil accountability. I just want to tie it back into why I framed it that way. So the new studies have come out that show that those who identify as spiritual are actually politically engaged and interested in this conversation. So they may not be tied to one religious community. Also, I'm not clergy. And many religious communities don't have clergy. The Baha'i community doesn't have ordained clergy. This idea, and that's something I have to work against. And that's where I was talking about religion can play a role in organizing and hierarchy that has to be challenged even interreligiously. I don't know how many panels or vigils I've been to where it's like 6 men standing there with their clergy garb of different religious traditions. And I'm like, wait, also the Sikh community, like these are communities that don't necessarily have formal clergy, or women are not admitted into formal clergy. And so how do we recognize that's an interesting, and there's a gender component to it too, is in fact, and I talked about this in a recent article, is that in the interfaith spaces, sometimes, for instance, Muslim women who may not have spiritual authority may find it in the interfaith space. So, and women of different religious traditions, that interfaith space can actually give them a form of spiritual or religious authority they may not have in their own spaces. So I think that definitely there is a way when you are coming together, particularly on issues of human rights, to talk about those that have, that's why I framed it as moral courage. It wasn't to me necessarily religious courage. For me, I find my moral courage in religion and in spiritual sources. But for others, they find their moral courage in a belief in humanism. And I think that that's why just reducing interreligious engagement to a dialogic process doesn't always create the capacity to work for forms of justice. And so I would definitely say that that is an area of expansion, and it's an area where you can have religiously conservative people, very religious. I work earlier today, I was on a dialogue, interfaith dialogue with an evangelical pastor. When you begin to see this notion of who is human and am I in your future and what is sacred, sacred doesn't always have to be a religiously justified thing, or doesn't have to be the same thing that's sacred. But if human life is deemed sacred, whatever your starting point is, those three questions allow for a collaboration on social justice, whether or not you have the same beliefs. So I just want to kind of open that door, is that I don't think the work on Islamophobia and xenophobia, in fact, the resettlement of refugees was largely carried out by very religiously conservative Christian communities. And it's been, in fact, some of the leading World Vision and other leading Christian organizations that have written letters and protested that Donald Trump has reduced the number of refugees to, I mean, it's inhuman, the numbers that at a time when there is such a need historically. And, at the table have been also Jewish community leaders, some who are religious and rabbis and others who are secular. To me, the question is, what is your moral courage that you bring to the table? How does it manifest? And are you willing to bring that unique perspective that enriches the conversation? So I see struggle as a unifying capacity, because to me, again, those that are oppressed are in the most sacred place. And that doesn't have to be religiously sacred. To me, it is. But that is, that is holy work. That is sacred work. And sacred, however you deem that. To me, sacred means something that is worth saving and protecting. So Indigenous communities, the protests that they have engaged in have taught many other religious communities that protest itself is a form of recognizing the need for protection of water, protection of resources. So.